So with that, I'd like to introduce you to Biking John.
Now, how do I start my presentation? Okay. Got it. I'm cyber challenged. I am actually, my nickname is Car Street John. I really, for 37 years, I have not owned a car. And I know that's really difficult. I mean, I really is like this. But it's also difficult in Central New Jersey. I want to thank like Texas, Texas Trails, Active Transportation, all those groups we saw on the screen right there. Thanks to every one of them for bringing me here to Texas, because I have family and friends here. So not only do I get to speak at this conference, I get to visit with friends and family in Leander, in Fort Worth, and Keller, Texas. So thank you for our family reunion. I really appreciate it. Well, when I was putting together this slideshow, I showed this title slide to my brother, my older brother Lee, in Keller, Texas. And he looked at this and said, "John, where in Texas is that?" And I said, "Well, Lee, actually, it's not. I think it was that pink Mercedes that sort of maybe gives it away." But one of the reasons I chose this as the title slide is there's lots of women on it. I mean, they're pretty women too, but I mean, the way they're women. And I have a colleague, she's a public health professor actually in Melbourne, Australia, Jan Gerard, and she does research specifically on getting women to cycle and public health implications. And she did an article for Scientific American, and one of the key quotes there was she thinks that women, and she is a woman, are an indicator species for bicycling. And unless you can get women to bicycle, you haven't got the right policies. And so if you want to look at a city or a state, she says, forget all the fancy sort of formulas and so forth. Look at the percentage of women who bike, and that sort of tells you whether or not you've got the policy right or not. By the way, I think these women look to me like Texas women. I mean, they could be, I think, they look very Texan. It's just that you don't normally see that many women cycling in Texas, I don't think. Well, although the main topic of my talk here is bicycling, clearly walking and bicycling are both extraordinarily valuable modes of active transportation. There's this word sustainability. Probably most of you have heard the word sustainability. But there are these three dimensions of sustainability: environmental, economic, and social sustainability. On every single one of those three dimensions, bicycling and walking are the best. There's virtually no environmental damage done by bicycling and walking, almost nothing used, very little in the way of non-renewable resources. They're certainly extraordinarily equitable. So almost everyone is physically able to bike, a little bit of training. Certainly affordable by high income, low income, everyone, really, women, men, all age groups. So in that sense, it's a socially equitable and sustainable mode of transportation, and economical as well. It doesn't cost much. You don't have to buy a $5,000 bike. For $20, $30, $50, $100, whatever, you can certainly get a bike that will do just fine. So it's certainly very low cost for the individual. It also doesn't really require nearly the kind of government infrastructure investment for, say, roads or even public transportation. So they're both on an individual basis and on sort of a social overall basis, extraordinarily sustainable modes of transportation. Now, the last point here is important because people say, oh yeah, you save money, but don't you waste time? No. There was a study done by the British Medical Association showing for every hour you bicycle or walk, you add more than an hour to your expected healthy lifetime, meaning your lifetime without a major disability. I just want to repeat that. For every hour you spend walking or cycling, you are adding more than an hour to your expected healthy lifetime. So anytime anyone tells you you're wasting your time walking or bicycling, say, whoa, I'm living a healthier life and longer than you. In addition to that, I have a colleague also in Australia, in Canberra, who's done research on what's called effective speed. And once you take into account that the average American spends 1 or 2 months of the year just earning the money to finance having a car, and you include that in calculations of speed, that the car is actually slower than the bicycle in most instances. So just consider that. And so you're making you healthier, and you're saving so much money that actually the bike is a faster mode of transportation. Now, I did a survey together with two colleagues, Jennifer Dill at Portland State and Susan Handy at the University of California Davis, a survey for the Journal of Preventive Medicine, looking at the entire literature throughout the world on what are the health impacts of cycling. I think we identified 15 studies, scientific studies, that specifically prove that indeed bicycling is very healthy for you. They lose all sorts of different measures, and that the health benefits of cycling far, far, far offset whatever the traffic dangers might be of cycling. In addition to which, and this came up yesterday in some of the talks, you can buy gym equipment, put it in your basement, you can have a membership in the gym, but most people just don't have the discipline to do that. I want to say, when I was a kid, I hated the gym. I hated gym class. I hated calisthenics, but I love walking and I love cycling. And I think a lot of people are sort of, especially when you get older, having the discipline to go to the basement or wherever you have your gym equipment and actually use it, or go to the gym, even if you have a membership, it's not as dependable, and it's certainly not as cheap as just being able to walk and cycle for daily transportation. You're instead of killing two birds with one stone, you're achieving really positive goals. You're actually achieving transportation, plus you're improving your health as well. And I think it's just more dependable than having a formal kind of exercise routine. There's two really important reasons for physical activity. One is it burns up those calories, so you can eat a lot more. I once gave a talk before the City Council of Toronto, and sort of went around the table, and each of the council people were describing why they biked or didn't bike. And one of the councilmen said, well, he bikes because this way he can eat more cookies. So if you bike so you can eat more cookies, that's great. But it certainly does burn out calories, no question about it. But there's another reason I think is really important. And this is a quote from the Journal of the American Medical Association, not exactly a left-wing journal, but just whether normal weight, overweight, or obese, physically inactive persons are 2 to 3 times more likely to die prematurely. So it really is important to get that physical activity. It's extraordinarily valuable cardiovascular exercise. And it doesn't take much. You don't have to run the marathon. Even 30 minutes a day, 40 minutes a day, just in the process of getting back and forth to work, to school, to church, doing shopping, visiting friends, it's really enough to give you that physical activity that's so valuable for your health. But the key thing about this, I'm not going to even try to interpret this exactly, but it's just saying even 30, 40 minutes a day is perfectly okay. And basically, just in the form of daily travel, you're going to get that amount of exercise, walking and cycling. Now, this is a scary chart. And it shows levels of obesity in different parts of the world. I really was wondering about this in terms of English, because all the English-speaking countries are the most obese. I mean, it just struck me. I mean, what is it about English that makes us speaking English bad? It's just incredible. I know I can speak fluent German, actually. It takes a little bit more effort. And in Italy, I use my hands a lot, so that, I guess that doesn't count. But there's dramatic differences here. I mean, look at the Netherlands or Japan. I mean, levels of 3%, 5%, 10%. But basically, we have a level of obesity in the United States. It's about 2 or 3 times higher what you have in these other countries. And it's not those other countries can't afford food. That's not the case. These are all high-income, high standard of living countries with more than enough to eat. And any of you that's been to Germany or to Finland or to Sweden or Austria, I mean, they don't exactly have low-calorie foods. So it's not that they're eating less, it's that they're getting a lot more physical activity on a daily basis. You've probably seen these maps before, but again, I don't want to scare you off too much. I'd rather focus on the solutions than the problems. But you can see Texas is, what do the Reds say? It's not as bad as Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, but certainly throughout the country, the point really is that obesity has become a more serious problem. It evidently has leveled off between 2008 2009, but leveled off in a very, very bad rate here, as you can see in the map for 2008. I think one of the most alarming trends is the quadrupling in obesity among children. I mean, our children are our future. And if we see a quadrupling in obesity among our children, that is something to be really, really concerned about, because it turns out also to show that if you're obese as a child, it's very difficult then to lose that weight as an adult. So it's really, really important to focus our policies, I think, on children and how we can get children more active, because then they're going to be more active as adults as well. Well, being car-free, of course, I'm going to tell you that this is the fault of the car. Even though I raise it as a question, I can tell you what I personally think the answer is. You have to be so careful in these academic journals. Oh, we haven't proved it 100%. But clearly there's a very strong correlation here. That if you add up walking, cycling, and public transportation, and public transportation, as one of the speakers yesterday mentioned, is also a kind of active transport, because 90% of all public transport trips start as a walk trip, getting to the bus stop or the bus station. And so that it also incorporates or generates active transportation in the form of walking or cycling, which you can see very, very clearly that as the percentage of trips, walking, cycling, and transit in these various countries goes up, that the percentage of adults who are obese goes down very sharply. And I think, you might say, well, okay, that's Europe. It's another continent. And we just can't do that here in the United States. But it turns out that a very high percentage of our trips, even in American metropolitan areas, are also short enough to walk, and especially short enough to bicycle. I mean, you can easily bicycle 2 miles, 3 miles, 4 miles. That's not really at all long distance to bike. And it turns out, as you can see, a fourth of all trips in American metropolitan areas were a mile or shorter. 40% of all trips were shorter than 2 miles. I mean, all those trips are bikeable. And I mean, I would argue that they're all pretty walkable too. But there's certainly that potential. So it's true that average trip distances are longer here than they are in Europe. But still, there's a large percentage of trips that are short enough here that could easily be covered by walking or by cycling. The other theme I would like to emphasize in this presentation, you'll see it as we continue on with all the photos and so forth, and that is I really do think that cycling should be something we make possible for everybody. It shouldn't just be young men who are well-trained on fancy bikes. It should be for women as well as men. It should be for every age group, including seniors, children, every age in between. It should be for people with different levels of physical abilities to the extent possible. I really do think that we should make cycling possible for people with different degrees of disabilities, and I have seen groups of cyclists with disabilities on tours in Australia, and it was one of the most moving things I've ever seen. So even to some extent, making cycling possible for people with disabilities, for every segment of our population we possibly can. Because I think there's tremendous individual benefits and societal benefits of doing that. Now, we have a ways to go. This is, I mean, you can look at it hopefully and say, wow, look how much more we can increase cycling. Or you can look at it negatively, we're sort of way down there again. But clearly, other countries have done a much better job of promoting cycling, making it safe, convenient, feasible for everybody. You can see here in the Netherlands, I mean, it's not a surprise, 27%. That's actually an underestimate, actually. That includes all trips, even in rural areas. If you just look at city trips, it turns out the percentage in the Netherlands is 35%. But, let's not quibble about details. They're much higher percentages, almost 20% in the Netherlands. Roughly 10% of all trips on the continent of Europe, say Germany, Finland, and so forth. I would also just note, it's not the case that, say, Finland has really mild weather. It tends to be up there with very cold winters. But I had a conversation with a woman who's the consul general of Finland in New York. And she said, oh, she cycles all the time. Her staff is all women too. I don't know why, but they cycle all over Helsinki. And that's just the way they get around. It doesn't bother them so much that it's that cold. So, I mean, it's not necessarily the case that these countries with high percentages of bike use, that they got perfect climates. It rains all the time in the Netherlands and Denmark. So whether it's the rain or the cold, I think those are, climate sort of is not an obstacle, I don't think. I know you have humid hot summers here in Austin. In 70 days, over 100, I think. But cycling cools you off. If you cycle fast enough, you go down. That's my theory for this. Well, there's a lot of hopeful. I want to especially focus on the hope here because many cities have made huge progress to increasing cycling. This is part of the survey we did, by the way, the international survey for the Public Health Journal of Preventive Medicine. And we sort of identified, I think it was like 20 or so case study cities that introduced packages of measures, not just infrastructure, but all sorts of programs, policies, education, training, and so forth and so on to increase cycling. And in most cases, very successful. So even in a big city like Berlin, we're talking about a population of something like the metropolitan area of Fort Worth, Dallas, doubling from 5% of all trips to 10% of all trips. But in almost all of these cities, there seems to be a limit. In Groningen, in the Netherlands, they did actually significantly reduce cycling crashes, but they didn't actually increase the mode share. I guess, once you get to 40%, it's sort of hard to get higher than that, but I don't think Texans have to worry about that yet. Not quite at that stage. Getting a little bit closer to home, if you look at some of these two American cities, Minneapolis has quadrupled the mode share of cycling. And this is for work trips, by the way. So this is percentage of trips I like to work from 1 to 4%, and then in Portland, everyone knows about Portland, but a six-fold increase in Portland from 1 to 6%. So I think the whole point is there's hope, but also big cities, Paris, London, significant increases in cycling, specifically though as a result of improvements and policies that make cycling more convenient, more attractive, and safer as well. I was sort of curious, okay, how's Texas doing? How are different Texas cities comparing to each other? I did this actually myself, just using the U.S. Census, using the 2008 U.S. Census, it's called the American Community Survey. And I was just sort of surprised. It looks like after this College Station in Austin had the highest percentages of bicycling, about 2.5% and 1%. And then you get to these cities on the right, Dallas with 0.15% and San Antonio 0.11. So there are lots of sort of room for increases there. But I was amazed at just how much variation there is really within the state of Texas itself. Well, going back to one of the indicators I wanted to show, that is the percentage of women cycling. If you look at continental Europe, so say Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, you have roughly 50-50. As many women cycling as men cycling. In fact, in the Netherlands, you have even more women cycling than you have men cycling. In comparison, in the United States, we have about 25% of bike trips are by women, so it's more about, I guess it's a 3-to-1 ratio between men and women. In Australia, it's even worse. It's about a 4-to-1 ratio, with only 21% of all trips are women. And then I was curious, well, how does Texas compare in this respect? These really are the official census statistics. I think maybe the sample size is really small, but I'm thinking, what's going on in Odessa? It must be a really, really small sample, but I'm thinking, what is it that 59% of all bicyclists in Odessa are women? Can this be true? I checked it 3 times. This is what the census says. So I don't know. It doesn't surprise me that Austin would have the 27% of students and staff of various agencies and so forth. And then also, I don't believe it's 0% for Fort Worth. Again, these aren't my numbers. These are the U.S. Census, but I think it was just a small sample. And it's probably a low figure, but I can't believe that it's all that much lower than Dallas at 3%. But clearly, we need to do more to get more women cycling in Texas, that's for sure. Well, I think we ought to also make policies feasible so that people at all ages can cycle. I do think you can start cycling at any age. I have a German graduate student in one of my classes, and she was telling me that she cycled to kindergarten. Can you imagine an American kid cycling to kindergarten? So you really can start cycling when you're young, and I think we can also, I hope, as I'm getting older, that we can all keep cycling as we get older and older. And lest you think I'm just making this all up, these are the official statistics. These are from their official national travel surveys, broken down by age group. And what I find really impressive is if you look at Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark, what you find is as people get older, they either maintain the level of cycling or it actually increases. And I want to point out this one statistic for the Netherlands. For those of you who might think that when you get old, it's like just impossible to bike. Turns out in the Netherlands, of those people who are 65 of age or older, a quarter of all their trips are by bike. In Denmark, it's not that high, but it's still 12% of all trips of the people. And this is in the age group 70 to 74, 12% of the trips by bike. And in Germany, you can see it goes up. It goes up from 7% in the lower age category up to 12%. The point here simply is, it is simply not true that as you get older, you're less and less able to bike. And these statistics indicate if you provide people with the right sort of conditions, you will continue to be able to bicycle as you get older. And I think this is really important because it gives seniors more mobility, more independence, and it gives them that active transportation. Every study in the world has shown that the healthiest seniors are the ones who remain active, who keep walking or cycling on a regular basis as they get older. And I think this sort of confirms this. This is a typical scene. I actually took this photo myself. It's like 4 or 5, no, it was 2 years ago actually. I was in Amsterdam. This is a typical scene. I know it's very untypical for Texas. I don't think I would ever see this in Texas, but I was just amazed. I wasn't actually waiting for this. I just happened to take the photograph and she showed up. But this is either a mother or grandmother. I'm not really sure, but you have a kid on the front, kid on the back, bags all over the place, and it's just sort of a normal everyday scene. The reason I like it, I really like families. I just really think families are important. And I like this sort of intergenerational cycling. So you have the mother or the grandmother with your kids. This is a photo I took last August. I was in Portland. We have a case study. Actually, have a research project for the U.S. Department of Transportation looking at cycling in large American cities. It's Portland as one of our case studies. I just happened to be cycling here and took this photograph. And again, I don't know, I just like family. So I really like this idea of the mother and the dad cycling with the 2 daughters and sort of showing them the rules of the road and what's safe for cycling and so forth. I just think it's I just like that scene. Any grandmothers, this is really neat. An Australian friend from Canberra actually took this photograph, and then I had to cut it out from a big photo, but it was originally a pretty sort of short photo. But I just thought this was pretty neat, grandmothers and their grandkids. And cycling is the way to get to heaven. Now, you may not have thought cycling is the solution, but yes, that is the way to get to heaven. This is actually a friend of mine took this photograph in Münster, Germany, which has 35% of all the trips by bikers right next to the Netherlands. Why? This is the way the nuns get around. The bishop rides a bike, and it's very famous. Actually, he wears a red helmet. But these nuns are not I'm serious, really. It's just the whole point of those slides is to show you really, in those sorts of cities where cycling is safe and convenient, pleasant and attractive, you really do get everyone cycling. And I think that's the way that's sort of how we try to improve our policies here in the United States. And in particular, I think we have to improve the safety of cycling, both the actual safety and the perceived safety of cycling. Because if you talk to American parents, many parents just won't let their kids get on the road at all because they think it's unsafe. And so we really have to provide facilities and conditions that make everyone feel comfortable and safe cycling. And there's many ways to do it. And you can see, and let's look at this positively as opposed to negatively, how much safer we can make cycling. This is different cycling fatality rates for different countries in the United States and in Europe. And you can see that the Netherlands and Denmark are about 4 or 5 times safer than we have here in the United States. This is controlled. This is per 100 million kilometers cycled. This is what we have available. Clearly, that cycling can be made very safe. That really is the point I want to make with this slide. I don't want to leave you with the impression that, oh, cycling is so dangerous. Because as I mentioned before, all the medical studies have shown that the health benefits of cycling way outweigh the dangers of cycling in terms of traffic crashes. Even given that, you can see we have the potential to make cycling much, much, much safer, as they have in Denmark and the Netherlands. And, I wear a helmet when I cycle, I can tell you that, because New Jersey motorists are worse than Texas motorists. I mean, homicidal is not an understatement. Not an overstatement, that's what I said. But anyway, this is, the Dutch, the Danes, the Germans, they just don't wear helmets. They don't feel that it's dangerous. And I know you might think this is just outrageous that they don't even have the kids wearing helmets, but they just don't. And in spite of that, they have this extraordinarily low rate of traffic crashes and traffic fatalities as well. One of the reasons is this whole notion of safety in numbers, that as more and more people cycle, cycling becomes safer because you have more and more motorists who are also at some time also cyclists, so they're more aware of the vulnerability of cyclists on the road, but also the more cyclists you have, the more political and public support you have for better cycling facilities, having separate bike paths, bike lanes, intersection modifications, which I'll show you in a second. So the good news here, that as we increase cycling, in every single case, you can look at different countries in the world, cities over time, countries over time, in every single case without exception, as you increase cycling levels, it becomes safer and safer and safer. So that if you're able to double or triple the amount of cycling in any Texas city, it is almost inevitable cycling will become safer, just so you know. But public policies are absolutely crucial to do this. It doesn't just happen by itself. And it's not just infrastructure. Infrastructure is really important. You got to provide those bike lanes and bike paths and bike parking, but that's one part of the solution. One of the things that I really want to leave you with is just how important public policies are. Because if you look at Europe, some of you probably think, oh well, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, they always were bike friendly. They always were very compact. They always made it hard to use a car and so forth. Not true. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were drastic declines in bicycling in almost every single European country. And I mean like 50% decline, 60% decline, gigantic declines in cycling, because public policies in the 1950s and 1960s were very pro-automobile. Lots of car parking. They wanted to, as the German term, adapting the city to the automobile. And as a result, huge increases in traffic crashes, all sorts of problems, and declines in walking, cycling, and transit. At the beginning of the 1970s, people started saying, wait a minute, this isn't right. You know, people are dying in these accidents. We're destroying our cities. We're making our cities unlivable. It just can't go on this way. And in country after country, city after city, policies were completely reversed. And so you see this in the beginning of the 1970s, mid-1970s, a complete reversal from pro-car policies to pro-walk, pro-bike, pro-transit policies. Examples. Again, I can say it, but if I show pictures, maybe you'll believe it. This is in Freiburg, Germany. If you look at the French, the avant aujourd'hui. Previously, so this is the 1960s or so, this was a car bridge. It was then made into a bike bridge in the 1980s. So this is what it looks like today. So taking it from the car, giving that bridge then to the bikes. You also have a walkway actually on each side, so it's both bicyclists and pedestrians. Almost all of the residential streets in German city have been traffic toned, and that means to 20 miles an hour. It's 30 kilometers or 20 miles an hour. And you can see, I mean, doesn't it look more attractive to you? This is exactly the same street before and after. And at Freiburg, now it's almost 100% of their streets are traffic toned in this way. So kids can play in the streets, you can bike in the streets, you can walk in the streets. It makes virtually every residential street very easy and safe and pleasant to bike on, to walk on. Another example of this shift in policies, exactly the same square in Freiburg, Germany, before and after. In the 1950s, 1960s, there was a parking lot. They turned it into a very nice fruit and vegetable market. Well, there's lots and lots of different ways that you want to increase cycling. So one of these policies that they introduced is every single one of these things. And I'll go through them in turn, hopefully using more pictures than words. And you'll note number one is indeed these infrastructure policies, but that's only part of the solution. It also is a matter of integrating it with public transit, neighborhoods training programs for motorists and for cyclists as well. Most central cities in Europe have extensive car-free zones. I'm not talking about one street here and one street there, or a block here, a block there. I'm talking about lots and lots of interconnected car-free streets. So it's really a whole area of the city that is car-free. This happens to be the main street of Münster, Germany, where I was for 2.5 years, but it's a perfect street for cycling and for walking as well. This is in the middle of Amsterdam, with showing the pictures of Amsterdam. But again, there's just no danger involved. There's no cars here. It's a very pleasant and interesting and attractive place to cycle. This is that same main street, actually, in Münster, Germany. You might have seen that church tower in the distance. This is the view from that church tower. The woman who was the head of cycling policies in Münster staged this very experiment. Wanted to show how much less space bikes take up than cars. And so for the exact same number of passengers, people, she had, on the left-hand side, this shows you how much space those cars take up to transport the exact same number of people as that many bikes. So anytime anyone tells you that providing cycling facilities is just, we just don't have the room for that. This is like the perfect counterproof saying, whoa, look how much less space those cyclists take up than that picture on the left with all of the cars there, which are also polluting the air and endangering everyone and so forth and so on. Just some examples. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. These sort of completely separate bike paths and bike lanes. This one is in the Netherlands. And you can see it's two-directional, but it's completely separated from motor vehicle traffic, which is one of the key things. I think when parents are making the decision, am I going to let my kids bike out there, are they going to have to be on the road with lots of traffic? And I think this is one of the Dutch approach, really is maximum separation from the motor vehicle traffic. can't always do it. And in fact, when they have traffic calming of the residential roads, that's considered by the Dutch to be every bit as good for all sorts of reasons. Another example of the same kind of a facility where you have a two-directional bike path, very nice separation. There's no conflict of any kind here with the motor vehicles. This is in Denmark, in Odense, Denmark. You can't really see it very well, but there's is there a pointer here? Oh, I did something wrong. I should have done that. I'm sorry. I'm not touching that button again. I truly.
It doesn't really work on the high-tech background.
Oh, that's okay. I'll leave it. I'm blowing up alone. Like I say, I'm cyber challenged. But you can barely see, but there is actually a curve. It might look to you like just sort of a bike lane, but there actually is a curve to the right there, not a very high curve, but it somewhat separates the motor vehicle traffic from the bicyclists there. And you can see, again, one of the points here is lots of different people. You have different age groups. And there is one man wearing a helmet, so it's not that no one wears a helmet, but you see men, you see women, you see seniors and younger people as well. This is a photograph I took. They have a bicycle expressway in Münster, Germany. I think it's like 6 or 7 kilometers in circumference. And they have walkways on both sides, and then they have the bike lane in the middle. And again, I think that has like 50,000, the volume of bike trips every day is like 50,000 bike trips a day on this bikeway. And this is not recreational. It looks really attractive, really nice, like you would read like a recreational path. This is like 95% utilitarian path because it connects all sorts of bike paths and bike lanes coming in from the outer areas and going into the center of the city. Another point I wanted to make, because I have a number of Dutch and German and so forth students that take my classes, I said, when you give a presentation, we want you to be sure that you emphasize that even in the suburbs, when you build any development of any kind in the suburbs of German cities, you are required by law to have these bicycling facilities as part of the basic infrastructure. So it's not something you build afterward. By law, by zoning codes, you must have these sorts of bicycling facilities as part of the infrastructure before the development is even approved. So it's not just those pretty pictures in the middle of Amsterdam, it's also on the very edges of these suburban areas, these new developments also have all of these bicycling facilities. So people start biking from the very beginning. And you can do nice things in the United States as well. I was out in Santa Barbara, this was a year and a half ago. What they did, and of course, being car free, I'm not exactly in favor of providing a lot of more infrastructure for cars, but they took out one of the car lanes and they made it into this very nice bi-directional bike path, and they provide very nice sort of a walking facility over on this side. Doesn't that look nice? I mean, now who would be afraid? I wouldn't be afraid cycling there. I mean, it's really a very, very attractive facility for sure. And they also had a very nice, they put in a number of new bike lanes as well, but this one is a very especially nice broad one, and it's far enough from the parked cars that you avoid the problem of dooring, which is a pretty serious problem. If you're ever in New York City, be really careful. Then they have put in actually, I think it's now 620 miles of bike lanes and bike paths over the past 7 or 8 years, but many of them you have parked cars, double parked cars, dooring problems, and so forth. So at any rate, but they have done this. So even in a huge, humongous, bike unfriendly city, as it were, New York City, the commissioner of transportation is a woman and a cyclist, and she's done all sorts of wonderful, wonderful things, I must tell you, including putting in these sorts of cycle tracks. I think you saw this actually yesterday in one of the slides, and the Department of Transportation gave me this to use as well, also for this presentation. But they have also special signals. Not sure if you can see, there's a red left-hand turn signal up there, which prevents left-turning cars from hitting cyclists who are going straight ahead. So it's not just that they have this separate cycle path that protects them from moving traffic. They also have special signals that prevent the cars from turning into the cyclists when they're making a turn. And it's sort of a typical situation here. This is in Copenhagen. We have this sort of maximum possible separation. I mean, it's not going to also always be desirable even to have separation between all of the different modes. But in this particular case, it's a fairly inner-city environment, and you can see here separate signals for the cyclist, a separate facility, and separate crossing indicators as well. Likewise, this is in Amsterdam. One of the problems with cycle tracks and bike paths is where you get to the intersection. That's the danger point there, because you're out of view of the motorist who's going straight in on the roadway, and then all of a sudden, say the motorist wants to make a right-hand turn, and the danger is that motorist going to see the cyclist as the cyclist is continuing across the roadway? Well, believe me, the Germans, the Danes, the Dutch have been experimenting with every conceivable design to try to avoid that danger, and this is one of the ways they do it. The bike path goes a little bit to the right, and the car making the right-hand turn, they deliberately, if you see those two yellow bollards, they deliberately make it a very, very sharp right-hand turn for the motorist. It slows down the motorist. This sort of a swerve slows down the bicyclist. They both have more time and space to see each other, and they found a tremendous decline in crashes for cyclists as a result of this particular sort of intersection design modification. Another example of that sort of a thing, this is a special lane that's accessing an intersection I believe it's in the Netherlands somewhere, but I can't remember now the name of the town. But you'll also see a special pull-out for the bus. And so it avoids the conflict between the bus passengers getting off the bus and the cyclists going straight in. That's what that was sort of neat as well. Just another example of a crossing of a bike lane. You can do all sorts of things. Special markings of the pavement, special signs to indicate to the motorist that the cyclist is coming across. But you can certainly do a lot of things to avoid that problem of bike paths crossing streets. And this is a side street, sort of a different kind of situation, but again, it's where you're on a cycle track or a bike path or a side track, whatever you want to call it, a side path, and you're trying to avoid the problem of cars possibly hitting those cyclists. Another example of infrastructure is a contraflow lane, where you have cyclists flowing against the main direction of traffic, so the cars can only come from this direction toward you. But you have a very, very nice contraflow lane facility here. This is in Strasbourg, in France, actually. Very nicely marked. This is the same sort of a thing, a contraflow lane in Freiburg, in Germany. Something that I don't think I've seen anywhere in the United States, this is called in German, eine falsche Einbahnstraße, which literally means a false one-way street. And this sign here says you can't go in this direction straight ahead. But the sign at the bottom says bicyclists are allowed. They're exempted from this one-way restriction. And so that's why in German it's called a falsche Einbahnstraße, or a false one-way street. In Münster, which is pretty reported among people, roughly half of all the one-way streets are false one-way streets where cyclists are allowed to cycle in both directions. And you might wonder, isn't that dangerous? But they actually have studied. And because the motorists are trained to expect cyclists coming from the other direction on those sorts of roadways, they have detected no increase whatsoever of any kind in cyclist injuries. So it can be done. Here back to North America, in Vancouver, in Canada, another example of ways you can, it gets sort of a contraflow access, not exactly a contraflow lane, but a contraflow access where the cars can only come toward you. You can have a special design that allows the cyclist into this neighborhood from another direction. The reason this is important, it increases the speed, the convenience of cycling. It means that one-way streets and dead ends are not nearly as much of a problem for cyclists. And for most people, the number one consideration as to, well, do you bike, do you walk, do you drive your car, is speed. From point A to point B, and from origin to destination. And if you can give cyclists all these sort of cut-throughs, exemptions from one-way restrictions and so forth, it really does increase the overall speed of cycling considerably. Gotta have bridges. A very nice left one, I think it's a photo I took in Melbourne. One to the right is in just outside of Münster, Germany, but you have very, very nice bicycling bridges. I mean, you have to somehow get across rivers and lakes and so forth, and do it very well. An example of a facility like this over the bridge over the Rhine River. Not even any customs control. You can ride the bridge, car over the bridge from one country to another. I just did it two years ago. It was really, really neat. You can also have floating bikeways. In fact, that's me, with a helmet. But I was cycling with an Australian colleague and his whole family. It was Melody here, their sister's name. But it was really fun. But they have the Brisbane River. They didn't have room on the mainland or on the land to provide a special bike lane on the path. So they actually provided a floating bike way right in the Brisbane River. Really, really attractive and well used. One of the keys, this is no surprise to any of you, but I mean, just building a bike path or a bike lane here or there just isn't sufficient. You really have to have a network, an integrated, coordinated network of cycling facilities that really allow you to get from one side of the city to the other. Because if there's huge gaps, it's like that's just not going to work. This is a cycling network in Freiburg in Germany, not a very big city, 400 million people, something like that. And yet they really do have, this does not even include the traffic calm streets, which is more than 90% of all the residential neighborhoods, and they're really part of the network as well. So if you're just looking at this specifically cycle paths and cycle lanes, an incredible network of cycling facilities. In Germany, this is in Berlin, in the main, obviously the capital of Germany, and I don't expect you to read all these German words, but they actually have an internet trip planning site. And you actually tell it, well, what are your preferences? Do you really want to stay off roads? Do you want to be going through parks? Is your preference speed? Is it comfort? Do you want to avoid inclines of any kind? It really lets you put your preferences into this program, and then what you get is this red line that gives you the preferred route. And in Denmark, you can even do it with your cell phone. Which I think is pretty neat, because you're often going to be on the road. You can, well, where's this route now? You're not going to have your computer handy, so I think that's sort of neat as well. I think it's important to give a signal, literally, a signal that cyclists should be given. That they're important, and you want to encourage cycling and give them an advanced green light. And in most of these German, Danish, Dutch cities, at intersections, cyclists will very, very often get the advanced green light. Which is important for a number of reasons. First of all, it means the cyclist can get to the intersection first, so it gives them greater speed. But the second thing is for safety, because once the cyclist is in the intersection, it means they're in the line of sight of the motorist, and they're less likely to get hit. Because not being visible is one of the most important causes for cycle crashes. This is another sort of a signal where the cyclist, as you can see on the bike, can trigger the green light for the cyclist. But you can do this in the United States as well. If you look here at Portland, they have something called the bike scramble, where bicyclists really want to go diagonally across. They didn't want to have to go this way and then that way, so to make two 90-degree angles. And so they have this special signal, and actually this is April, he's the head of walking policy of all things in Portland. And I said, let's try this out again and again and again. The motorist got really upset with me. Because I really like this. It's like a sense of power. I really don't like cars. But the sense of power, you just put your bike on that little strip there, and it turns the light green for the cyclist and red for the motorist. So I thought it was a neat sort of invention. Another example of the same sort of a thing, we have a bike-activated green light. This one is near the Metro of Vancouver anyway. This is in Münster, a city where I was living for quite a few years. And it puts a lot of things together. First of all, you have a special access lane for bicyclists to get to the front of the intersection. Number two is, you can't see it, this sign right here says, when the light is red, that the cars have to stop at this sort of stop line here, but it specifically tells the cyclist, you're supposed to go all the way to the front and fill up the entire space in front of the car. Then the cyclists, in addition to that, get an advanced green light, and you can see the result. The cyclists are already in the middle of the intersection before the cars even start. It's safer, it's more convenient, and it works really, really well. In addition to which, and this is also in Münster, you can mark the bike lane crossings at the intersections, but they're more visible. Again, visibility is key in terms of promoting safety, so you really have to think about that. This is one of the neatest. If only you could get this in Austin, it would be so neat. People would come from all over the country to see it. They get a tourist attraction. You're not going to believe what they do. This is in Odense, Denmark, town of maybe it's like, again, 200,000 people, something like that. And first of all, you can see on the left here that you have a special cycle track. So you can see the curve, how it separates it a little bit from the roadway. But you see those bollards with those sort of teal-colored lights? What they do, they have something called the green wave. And they have pulsating green lights on those bollards at the speed at which, if the cyclist is following the pulse of those lights, the cyclist will always get a green light at every intersection. That's pretty neat. And then they have digital readouts as well, saying you're traveling at how many miles per hour. But they also then say, well, how do they calibrate this speed? What speed are you going to set this green wave to? But they're clever enough, and well, on certain routes, it's going to be, maybe 15 or 60 kilometers an hour. On other routes, 22 kilometers. They gauge it, so if it's a long-distance commuter route, they set it at a higher speed. If it's a shorter route, they set it at a lower speed. But I thought that was just really neat. I mean, not only giving them the green light, but even giving them these bollards with the pulsating lights. That's like in space age. All sorts of other little things you can do. Like they have lots and lots of these sort of shortcuts, they call them. So rather than the cyclist having to go all the way to that intersection, they have shortcuts. So the cyclist just takes a right-hand turn there. It just saves time. It's more convenient. It's just easier. And here, why should you have to stop at a red light? If it's a T intersection, then you're just going to go straight ahead anyway. So lots of these, basically, this is saying exemption. Bicyclists can do anything. You should. To the left is all sorts of examples of signage. This is also Susan Handy, my colleague at UC Davis, who does a lot of research on cycling, was in Odense. I think Jennifer Dill was as well. But you can see really, really nice signage, connections to mass transit. To the right, another really neat thing in Odense, that they have this counter. So you can see the bicyclists going by here, and it actually has both a digital readout and it has this sort of a column that goes up and up and up and up as more and more cyclists pass by this counter. Again, certain nice. Another example of some very, very, very common signage that you see all over Germany in terms of the destination and the distance to the various cycle paths. And how about this? Air pumps. Isn't that a neat thing? Just all over the city, there's having these air pumps. It's convenient, especially if you got a flat tire. Traffic calming, I'm not going to go through all this in great detail because it's just too much to cover, but I think it's one of the most neglected but most important policies we can possibly have to make our cities more bikeable, and that is to reduce the speeds of motor vehicles in our residential neighborhoods. And you can do it in all sorts of ways, but pretty much you're going to have to do something with infrastructure as well, whether that's traffic circles or there's a whole range. I'm not going to obviously have time to go through this, but it's more than speed bumps, I can tell you that. There's a lot of little, like 30 or 40 or 50 different ways that you can traffic calm your residential neighborhoods, and you have to find sort of what's just the right combination for you. I know in the city where I live, in Highland Park, New Jersey, the mayor was thinking, well, we'll just put in speed humps, that's traffic calming, but it's much, much more than that. It really is. And this is why it's so important to restrict speed. This is from the World Health Organization, so I think it's a pretty credible source. And you can see that as the speed of motor vehicles increases, it's like exponentially increases the likelihood that a pedestrian or a cyclist is going to get killed. So really it's important to reduce that motor vehicle speed. You've seen all these things before, traffic seats, traffic circles and so forth, bulb outs and neck downs, curb extensions and whatnot. This is an example of a really attractive kind of a traffic calming where, again, you're restricting the direction of the car travel, narrowing the width of the roadway, and yet giving cyclists better access. Here's an artificial sort of a dead end for the cars, but a cut through for the cyclists. Again, what does this do? It increases the effective speed, as it were, of cycling. It's giving cyclists more flexibility in terms of their routes, their time, and so forth, and making things more difficult for the cars. And in particular, it's discouraging the through traffic from this residential neighborhood. So I think it's important for that reason as well. This is just, you'll see now a few examples of what traffic calming can look at. This is nothing expensive or extravagant. It's just not. Oh my goodness. This is not, just various examples here of traffic calming, what they might look like. This is extreme traffic calming. It's called Pucher, and this is where the speed limit actually is 5 miles an hour. This means this area is really meant to be every bit as much for kids playing in the street as for walking or biking. It's just part of like your front yard, and it's something that's really used more and more in these European cities. In Portland, you have these bicycling boulevards, which are in effect really traffic calm streets, but very, very effective. You have lots of bicycling streets in German cities, Dutch cities, where basically these are streets. There's narrow streets intended for bikes, but where you're allowed to use your car. Bike transit integration, a very, very important factor here. Maybe not so much in Texas because there's not all that much transit here, but now we have most buses equipped with bike racks. And in fact, that's tripled. The percentage of buses in the United States with bike racks has actually tripled since the year 2000, so we've really made some progress there. Bike stations, we just took this photograph actually at Union Station in Washington, D.C. Very, very nice sort of multifunction bike station. This is the one in Worcester, Germany. You probably wouldn't need one quite this size. This holds 3,500 bikes. Provides everything, including bike washing. How did that be? Bike washing facility. That is full service. They have medium-term, long-term, short-term bike parking, bike repairs, everything in that, but also bike portion. You can find bike parking at bus stops, bike sort of racks here, these vertical racks that are on the light rail vehicles, and there are light rail systems here in Texas, so it's something, I'm not sure if they exist yet on the light rail systems in Texas, but I know the light rail systems in New Jersey and Minneapolis do have these vertical bike racks. Another example is bike parking. This is at a light rail station in Freiburg. And you can also have these sort of entire cars. This is in the commuter rail system. You have commuter rail here in some of the Texas cities as well, so you might consider doing this. They have so many cyclists there in the Bay Area that they actually have 2 cars devoted just for bike parking. It's been very, very successful. You can also, in terms of bike parking, bike parking is really important. I mean, you can put it in your zoning ordinance, building codes, to make sure that you're allowed to take your bike into your office, if there's some sort of bike parking facilities, maybe even shower facilities or storage facilities. But then at the street level, you can take car parking away and turn it into bike parking, such as this case here in San Francisco. Well, no big surprise, there's bike parking in Amsterdam, but they have a lot of bikes there. And they have some people think, well, the Netherlands is the Netherlands and so forth, but they have every single year they're making some sort of improvement. They never, ever, ever rest on their laurels. They're always trying to make things safer, more convenient. There are more and more sheltered parking, secure parking, convenient, all sorts of rental systems. They're always working to make it better and better and better. Traffic education, I think, is absolutely crucial, both for motorists and for cyclists. One of the things that I'll really try to wrap up as soon as I can, but I really want to show you this because it's important. And my German students have got to show this. And that is, these are multiple choice. It's actually from the official German exam to get a driver's license. And for each of these photographs or diagrams, there's a multiple choice. And so what are you supposed to do in this case as a motorist? And in every single case, if you look at the upper left, upper right, and so forth, you must yield to the cyclist. You as a motorist must yield to the cyclist. To the lower right, you might say, what's going on in that photograph? And that says, you as a motorist have the responsibility to anticipate that kid on that bike possibly darting out into the roadway. And if you hit that kid, it is your responsibility, your fault by law. And therefore, when you see a kid or a senior, this is the way the law works in the Netherlands and in Germany, if you see a kid or a senior on a bike, you must anticipate this and take it into account in the way that you're driving. They have extensive cycling education. In German, by the 3rd or the 4th grade, every Danish, Dutch, and German kid, girl and boy, has had extensive cycling education and training. First, theoretical training, sort of written training, then they have a special course, then they go actually onto the roadway. Marketing cycling, I'll do it really fast now, but you can do a lot to get kids to cycle. I mean, wouldn't you be turned down by the cycling ducky? Come on. I know how to do that. You have cycling competitions, you have cycling training also for other groups, for maybe people who haven't cycled as a kid, they want to learn how to cycle as an adult. Give people free bikes to get around work. But I thought this was one of the best of all. This is for fat men. And I couldn't believe it. They had a special program called Get Rid of the Sack. And they had this man in a sack going around pointing to every man with a pot belly. You get active. You walk or you get on the bike, get rid of that pot belly. I can think if this were New York, he'd be dead. I don't know how Texas would respond to this, but in New York, it's a no-go. But they even had a television program. It was television. They actually had this guy dressed up as a sack, going and telling people to get active. We have special tours for seniors and so forth. Safe routes to schools. We have no time for any of this. But I think it's really important, the whole issue of getting kids to walk and to bike. And part of that is getting them to walk and bike to school, because we've had just the reverse trend. Tremendous decline in walking and biking to school. And as a result, just you can see the relationship here, as kids have walked and biked to school less and less, increasing obesity rates among kids. This is how the Dutch get to school, without question. Bike to school in California, we're trying. We really have to do a much more extensive effort than that. I don't have time to go into these sorts of things. I do think that what's really important is enforcing laws that protect cyclists on the roadways, and that motorists who endanger or actually hit cyclists are to be much more severely punished than they currently are. Conclusions, okay, I'm almost here. One, cycling is great. It's healthy for you, it's good for the environment, and I also think almost everyone has the potential to bike. And it would be reduce benefits not only for individuals who are bicycling, but also for the environment. It reduces congestion, it reduces energy use, it reduces global warming. I mean, it's like the perfect mode. And I think we need to do more in terms of spreading this message of the public benefits, really to society as a whole, individual benefits as well as social benefits of cycling, to get all those public programs put into place. As I said, the key to that big boom in cycling in Germany, Netherlands, Denmark between the 1970s and 1990s was a complete shift in public policy. It took a lot of public support, political courage, but they did it. And you had this tremendous improvement in public policies in these European cities. What was the result? Surprise, surprise, a doubling and tripling of levels of cycling in many of those cities. Okay, I'm going to stop now.